The eviction notice trembled in Margaret Chen's weathered hands like a dying leaf clinging to winter's last branch. 72 hours. That's all she had left before the bank would seize the only home she'd known for 37 years. The modest ranch house where she'd raised 2 children, buried a husband, and watched her dreams slowly crumble like old mortar between desperate fingers. "Come on, boys," she whispered to the 3 dogs sprawled across the threadbare living room carpet, their ribs showing through patchy coats that hadn't seen a groomer in months. Time to go. After the first description, simply use Duke in subsequent references, lifted his grizzled head first. He'd been Robert's dog, her late husband's shadow, during those final cancer months when hope felt as fragile as spun glass. Beside him, after first mention just Penny, stretched her scarred legs, a rescue Margaret had found bleeding by the highway 2 winters ago when she still believed tomorrow might be kinder than today. And little Buster, the scrappy terrier mix with 1 missing ear, yawned and shook himself awake, his tail wagging with the kind of blind optimism that made Margaret's chest ache. The morning sun slanted through windows she could no longer afford to clean properly, casting long shadows across boxes she'd packed and unpacked 3 times now, unable to decide what memories were worth carrying into an uncertain future. Her entire life condensed into cardboard containers. Robert's Purple Heart from Vietnam, their wedding china with the chip on the sugar bowl, photo albums documenting happier decades when her smile reached her eyes and bills didn't arrive like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. Margaret's phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, its cracked screen displaying another number she didn't recognize. Debt collectors had become as regular as sunrise, their voices sharp with professional indifference as they demanded money she simply didn't possess. The life insurance from Robert's death had evaporated into medical bills and mortgage payments, leaving her Social Security check stretched thinner than tissue paper across the endless demands of survival. She silenced the phone and knelt beside Duke, running her fingers through his coarse fur. "What do you think, old boy? Where does a broke widow with 3 dogs go when the world decides she's used up all her chances?" Duke's tail gave a weak thump against the floor, and Margaret felt tears threatening to spill over the careful dam she'd constructed around her emotions. Crying was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when strength was the only currency that still held any value in her rapidly shrinking world. The idea struck her as she stood in the driveway, loading the last of their possessions into her 15-year-old Honda Civic with its failing transmission and bald tires. She'd been driving past the abandoned Sinclair station on Route 47 for months, that lonely sentinel of America's forgotten highways standing empty against the prairie sky like a monument to better times. The faded dinosaur logo still clung to the sign, the rust had eaten through the metal in places, and weeds grew through cracks in the concrete, where thousands of travelers had once stopped for gas and hope, and the promise that the road ahead held something worth reaching. "Nobody's using it," she said aloud, her voice carrying across the windswept silence. "Maybe we could just stay there for a while until I figure things out." The dogs seemed to sense her determination, piling into the back seat with renewed energy as Margaret turned the key and listened to the engine cough to life. If you're finding Margaret's story as gripping as I am, please take just 30 seconds to hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps me bring you more incredible true stories like this one. She didn't look back at the house where she'd learned to love, to lose, to endure. Looking back was another luxury she couldn't afford. The abandoned gas station sat 37 miles outside of Millbrook, Nebraska, where the highway stretched toward horizons that seemed to mock her with their endless possibilities. Margaret had passed this place countless times over the years, watching it slowly surrender to neglect and weather, The pumps stood like rusted soldiers at eternal attention, their hoses long since removed, their digital displays dark as winter nights. The small convenience store attached to the service bays had windows covered with plywood and graffiti, teenage declarations of love and rebellion fading under layers of dust and time. But something about the place had always called to her. Perhaps its stubborn refusal to completely disappear, the way wildflowers had begun to reclaim the edges of the parking lot, transforming abandonment into a kind of accidental beauty. Today, as she pulled into the weed-choked lot with everything she owned crammed into her dying car, it felt less like trespassing and more like coming home, to a place that had been waiting for her all along. The dogs tumbled out as soon as she opened the door, Duke moving carefully on his stiff legs, while Penny and Buster explored this new territory with the enthusiasm of creatures who had learned to find adventure in the smallest changes. Margaret watched them sniff around the old tire display, their tails wagging as they marked their temporary territory, and felt something close to peace settle into her bones for the first time in months. "Well, boys," she said, surveying their new domain, "it's not much, but it's ours for now." She'd brought a tent from the garage sale she'd held the week before, one of Robert's old camping supplies that had gathered dust since their last trip to the Black Hills 15 years ago. The canvas smelled like mothballs and memory, but it would keep the rain out and give them a place to sleep that didn't cost money she didn't have. She pitched it behind the building, where a small grove of cottonwood trees provided some shelter from the wind and curious eyes of passing motorists. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that made the abandoned station look almost romantic in the fading light, Margaret sat on an overturned crate with a can of beans warming over the camping stove she'd managed to salvage from her former life. The dogs lay at her feet, finally relaxed after days of sensing her anxiety, their breathing steady and content in the way that animals possessed when they trusted their human to make everything all right somehow. "You know what's funny?" she said, addressing the gathering darkness as much as her canine companions. "I've never felt so scared and so free at the same time. Like, maybe losing everything isn't the end of the story after all." Duke lifted his head to look at her, his cloudy eyes reflecting the last light of day, and Margaret could swear she saw Robert in that gentle gaze. Not the wasted shadow he'd become in those final months, but the strong, laughing man who had promised her that love could conquer anything if you just held on tight enough and refused to let go. She finished her beans as stars began to emerge in the vast Nebraska sky, each point of light a reminder that some things endure no matter how dark the world became. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears, new impossibilities to navigate, but tonight, surrounded by loyal companions in a forgotten place that felt strangely like sanctuary, Margaret Chen allowed herself to hope that sometimes the end of one story was simply the beginning of another, stranger and more wonderful than anything she could have imagined when she still believed that home was a place you paid for rather than a feeling you carried inside your heart. This story is taking some incredible turns, isn't it? If you're as invested in Margaret's journey as I am, smash that like button and share this with someone who loves against-all-odds survival stories. It takes just a moment, but means everything to me. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of wild roses and distant rain, and Margaret closed her eyes and listened to the night sounds of her temporary kingdom. 3 dogs dreaming of better days, an old building settling into its bones, and the quiet heartbeat of a woman who had lost everything except the thing that mattered most, the courage to keep going when giving up would have been so much easier. Margaret woke to the sound of Duke whimpering in the pre-dawn darkness, his arthritic joints protesting the cold that had settled into their makeshift camp like an unwelcome visitor. The temperature had dropped during the night, and she could see her breath forming small clouds in the cramped tent as she reached for the flashlight that had become her most precious possession. 3 days at the abandoned gas station, and already she was learning the cruel mathematics of homelessness. How every calorie burned meant one less meal. How every battery used brought her closer to darkness. How every dollar spent was a step further from any chance of climbing back to the life she'd lost. "Easy, boy," she whispered, running her fingers along Duke's spine, feeling the sharp ridges of his vertebrae through skin that seemed thinner each day. The dog food she'd managed to buy with her last $20 wouldn't last the week, and she'd already started sharing her own meager portions with them, watching their grateful eyes and knowing she was failing the creatures who depended on her most. Penny stirred beside them, the golden retriever mix pressing her warm body against Margaret's side with the intuitive understanding that animals possessed human pain. Buster remained curled in the corner, his small form radiating heat like a living furnace, but even he couldn't chase away the chill that seemed to emanate from Margaret's bones, not the cold of Nebraska mornings, but the deeper freeze of desperation that no amount of body warmth could thaw. She'd been dreaming of Robert again, not the skeletal figure from his final days, but the man who used to wake before sunrise to make her coffee, who would sit on their back porch and plan gardens they'd never plant, trips they'd never take, grandchildren they'd never have. In the dream, he'd been standing by the gas pumps outside, pumping fuel into a car that kept changing. First their old Buick from the 70s, then the Honda they'd bought when money was tighter, finally settling into the current Civic with its failing transmission and mounting repair bills. "You always were stubborn," he'd said in the dream, his voice carrying that gentle humor she missed more than breathing. "But this stubborn might just be the kind that saves you." Now, as she unzipped the tent flap and stepped into the gray morning light, Margaret wondered if Robert would recognize the woman she'd become. This hollow-eyed creature in unwashed clothes, counting pennies and rationing hope like it was a finite resource. The woman he'd married 43 years ago was full of plans and possibilities, convinced that hard work and love could overcome any obstacle. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone she'd known in passing but could no longer summon when she looked in mirrors or caught her reflection in store windows. The dogs followed her outside, Duke moving like an old man getting out of bed, all careful steps and suppressed groans. Margaret had found a water spigot on the side of the building that still worked, some miracle of municipal oversight that meant they wouldn't die of thirst, at least not immediately. She filled their metal bowls and watched them drink, their tongues pink and eager, and tried to ignore the way her own stomach cramped with hunger. She'd eaten yesterday, half a sleeve of crackers and a can of soup heated over the camping stove, but the gnawing in her belly had become a constant companion, as familiar as the weight of worry that pressed against her chest every waking moment. At the Walmart 30 miles down the highway, she'd stood in the checkout line behind a young mother with 3 children, watching the woman count food stamps with the same careful precision Margaret now applied to her dwindling cash, and felt a kinship she'd never expected. Poverty, she was learning, was its own country with its own language, and she was still struggling to become fluent in the dialect of desperation. The convenience store attached to the gas station had been boarded up for what looked like years, but Margaret had discovered that some of the plywood covering the windows was loose, held in place by nails that had rusted enough to work free with persistent effort. She'd managed to create a small gap, not enough to constitute breaking and entering, she told herself, just enough to peer inside and see what remained of someone else's abandoned dream.
Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that penetrated the dim interior, illuminating shelves that had been picked clean by scavengers, or perhaps removed by whoever had locked up for the final time. But the basic infrastructure remained: a counter, a cash register old enough to require actual keys, cooler units that hummed with phantom electricity. In the back, she could make out a small office and what looked like a storage room, spaces that might offer better shelter than the tent if the weather turned nasty. "What do you think?" she asked Duke, who had followed her to the window and now pressed his nose against the gap in the plywood. "Think anyone would mind if we moved inside? Just temporarily until I figure out what comes next?" Duke's tail moved in what she chose to interpret as approval, and Margaret felt a spark of something that might have been hope if she'd been brave enough to name it. The building was solid, built in an era when things were constructed to last rather than to maximize profit margins. The roof looked intact, and she hadn't seen any evidence of water damage during her reconnaissance missions. It would be warmer than the tent, safer from both weather and the occasional truck driver who slowed down to stare at their unusual campsite with curiosity that made her skin crawl. But moving inside felt like a line she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. Camping in the parking lot could be explained as a temporary stop, an eccentric choice rather than a criminal act. Breaking into the building, even an abandoned one, carried implications that frightened her more than sleeping rough under the Nebraska sky. She was already invisible to the world in so many ways, too old to be hired for decent work, too poor to matter to politicians, too proud to beg from children who had their own struggles. Becoming an actual criminal would complete her transformation from citizen to ghost, and she wasn't sure she was ready to disappear that completely. The morning stretched ahead of her with the peculiar weight that unemployed time possessed. Each hour both endless and precious. She had nowhere to be, and nothing specific to accomplish. Yet every moment felt charged with the urgent need to solve the unsolvable puzzle of survival. The Honda needed gas. The needle was hovering just above empty, and she knew from experience that running out of fuel would transform inconvenience into catastrophe. But gas cost money, and money was a resource she could measure in single digits now. She'd applied for 17 jobs in the past month, everything from grocery store clerk to night janitor to driving for meal delivery services. The applications had been submitted online from the public library in Millbrook. Her careful typing interrupted by young mothers helping their children with homework, and teenagers gaming on computers that seemed impossibly fast compared to the ancient desktop she and Robert had shared. Each rejection email had arrived like a small death, polite form letters that thanked her for her interest while making it clear that her age, her gaps in employment, her lack of recent experience made her unemployable in an economy that worshipped youth and discarded experience like outdated technology. "We'll figure it out," she told Penny, who had settled beside her on the concrete steps that led to the store's entrance. These dogs had already lost one home when Margaret could no longer afford the pet deposits and monthly fees that landlords demanded. They'd trusted her to find them shelter and safety, and instead she'd led them to this liminal existence between housed and homeless, between citizen and exile. The sun climbed higher, promising heat that would make the tent unbearable by midday. Margaret had learned to move their few possessions into the shade of the building during the warmest hours, creating a routine that provided structure to days that otherwise threatened to dissolve into shapeless anxiety. She spread Robert's old sleeping bag in the shadow of the defunct gas pumps and settled down with a paperback novel she'd rescued from her last life, a romance about second chances and unexpected love that felt like a message from a universe that still believed in happy endings.
But the words blurred as her mind wandered to practical concerns that couldn't be resolved by fictional solutions. Duke needed medication for his arthritis, pills that cost more per month than she'd once spent on groceries for a week. Penny had developed a cough that worried Margaret, a dry hack that sounded too much like the breathing problems Robert had experienced during his final months. And Buster, despite his apparent health, was losing weight along with the rest of them, his ribs beginning to show through his patchy coat. She'd considered surrendering them to the animal shelter in Millbrook, the kind of mercy killing of the heart that homeless people faced every day. The volunteers had been kind when she'd called, explaining their no-kill policy and their efforts to find loving homes for abandoned pets, but the word abandoned had stuck in her throat like a bone. These weren't abandoned animals, they were her family, the only living creatures who looked at her with unconditional love and saw something worth protecting. Giving them up would be like cutting off her own limbs, and she wasn't ready to mutilate herself for the sake of practicality. A truck rumbled past on the highway, its diesel engine coughing black smoke into the pristine morning air. The driver didn't slow down or show any interest in the woman and 3 dogs who had taken up residence at the forgotten gas station, but Margaret found herself waving anyway, an automatic gesture from her former life when strangers were neighbors and communities looked out for each other. The truck disappeared over a rise in the road, leaving behind only the smell of exhaust and the lingering reminder that the world was full of people going somewhere, while she remained stranded in the space between destinations. By afternoon, the heat had driven them back to the tent, where they lay panting in the stifling air and tried to conserve energy for the cooling hours of evening. Margaret had rationed herself to 1 bottle of water, saving the rest for the dogs, and her head pounded with the beginnings of dehydration. She'd learned to recognize the signs, the dry mouth, the dizzy spells, the way colors seemed too bright and sounds too sharp. Her body was becoming a foreign country, full of new pains and limitations she was still mapping. She must have dozed, because when she opened her eyes, the sun had moved significantly toward the western horizon, and Duke was whimpering again, but this time with excitement rather than pain. She followed his gaze and saw a pickup truck pulling into the lot, its tires crunching over the gravel and weeds that had begun to reclaim the asphalt. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched a man in his 50s climb out of the driver's seat, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He wore work clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt despite the heat, steel-toed boots that had seen honest labor. His face was weathered in the way that spoke of decades under the sun, and when he looked in her direction, his expression was more curious than hostile. "Afternoon," he called, raising one hand in greeting. "You folks doing all right over there?" Margaret struggled to her feet, acutely aware of her appearance, the unwashed hair, the wrinkled clothes, and the general aura of defeat that seemed to cling to her like smoke. "We're fine," she managed, her voice rusty from hours of silence. "Just passing through." The man walked closer, his movements slow enough to avoid alarming the dogs, who had positioned themselves protectively around Margaret's legs. "My name's Bill Henderson. I own the farm about 2 miles up the road. Been meaning to stop by and check on this old place. Mind if I ask how long you're planning to stay?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Margaret felt the familiar weight of judgment settling onto her shoulders. She was trespassing, squatting, existing in a space where she didn't belong. But before she could formulate an apology or excuse, Bill's expression shifted to something that looked suspiciously like understanding. "Lost my wife 3 years ago. Cancer. Know something about starting over when the world decides you're finished. This place has been empty for 8 years now. The owner lives back east somewhere, probably forgot it exists. Far as I'm concerned, you're not hurting anything being here." Margaret blinked back tears, unprepared for kindness from a stranger who owed her nothing. "I don't know how long we'll stay. I'm trying to figure out what comes next." Bill nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "Sometimes the figuring takes a while. You need anything? Water pump working okay?"
"It's working fine," Margaret said. "Thank you for asking. I'll stop by again in a few days if that's all right. This country can be hard on folks traveling alone." He tipped his hat, a gesture from an earlier, more courteous era. "You take care now." As his truck disappeared down the highway, Margaret sank back onto the concrete steps and let the tears come. Not the bitter weeping of despair, but something cleaner, like rain after a long drought. Maybe she wasn't as invisible as she'd feared. Maybe the world still held people who understood that survival sometimes required the grace of strangers and the mercy of abandoned places that offered shelter to lost souls. The sun was setting, painting the sky in familiar shades of amber and rose, and Margaret called the dogs to her for their evening meal, the last of the kibble mixed with water to make it stretch further. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new fears, new impossibilities to navigate. But tonight, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Robert's death, the possibility that she wasn't facing the darkness alone. The storm arrived on their 10th day at the gas station like an angry god flexing its muscles across the Nebraska plains. Margaret had watched the wall of dark clouds building on the western horizon since early afternoon, their towering presence promising the kind of violence that turned trailer homes into matchsticks and sent livestock running for shelter. The air itself seemed to thicken with electricity, making the hair on her arms stand at attention while the dogs paced restlessly around their makeshift camp, whimpering at frequencies only they could interpret. "Looks like we're moving inside whether I like it or not," she told Duke, who was already attempting to burrow under the sleeping bag despite the oppressive heat. The first fat raindrops had begun to fall, striping the hot asphalt with audible hisses that sounded like the earth itself gasping in relief. But Margaret knew better than to trust the initial gentleness. Nebraska storms were notorious for their ability to transform from blessing to catastrophe in the space of a heartbeat. She'd spent the morning working at the loose plywood covering the convenience store window, using a rusty screwdriver she'd found in the Honda's glove compartment to pry away decades of stubborn nails. Her hands were raw and bleeding by the time she'd created an opening large enough to squeeze through, but the accomplishment felt monumental. Her first successful act of rebellion against a world that seemed determined to grind her into dust. The interior of the abandoned store was a tomb of someone else's shattered dreams, filled with the particular sadness that clung to places where hope had died slowly. Dust particles danced in the shafts of light that penetrated the gloom, and the air carried the musty scent of neglect mixed with the phantom aroma of coffee and hot dogs from the deli counter that once served travelers seeking more than just gasoline for their journeys. But it was dry, and it was shelter, and as the first crack of thunder rolled across the plains like a bowling ball down heaven's lanes, Margaret felt a surge of gratitude for this forgotten sanctuary that had opened its arms to receive them. She helped Duke through the window first, the old German shepherd's dignity intact despite the undignified nature of their entrance, followed by Penny and Buster, who seemed to view their new accommodations as an adventure rather than a crime. The storm struck with the fury of an Old Testament plague, transforming the world outside into a liquid nightmare of wind and rain that lashed against the building with enough force to make the walls shudder. Margaret had experienced Nebraska weather for 70 years, but she'd never faced it from such a vulnerable position, never felt so acutely aware of her own mortality as she did listening to the storm's rage from inside a building that might or might not have the structural integrity to keep them alive. Lightning illuminated the interior in strobing flashes, revealing details she hadn't noticed during her earlier reconnaissance missions. The cash register was ancient but solid, built in an era when things were constructed to last rather than to be replaced every few years. Behind the counter, a doorway led to what had once been the office, and beyond that, another door marked "Employees Only" that remained stubbornly locked despite her attempts to force it open. But the floor that captured her attention as the storm raged overhead was specifically a section near the back wall where the linoleum had begun to curl and separate, revealing what looked like metal underneath. Margaret had initially dismissed it as some kind of structural support, but as she settled in for what promised to be a long night of wind and worry, she found herself studying the anomaly with growing curiosity.
"What do you think, boys?" she asked the dogs, who had arranged themselves in a protective triangle around her makeshift bed of sleeping bags and salvaged cushions. "Think there's something under here worth investigating?" Duke's response was to rest his grizzled muzzle on her leg, but Buster seemed more intrigued by the question, trotting over to sniff at the edges of the raised linoleum with the intensity of a creature who had learned to find treasure in the most unexpected places. When he began scratching at the metal surface underneath, his claws producing a hollow ringing sound that seemed to echo longer than physics should have allowed, Margaret felt her pulse quickened with something that might have been hope if she'd been brave enough to name it. The storm continued through the night, a relentless symphony of destruction that made sleep impossible, and prayer seemed like the only reasonable response to forces beyond human control. Margaret lay awake listening to the building creak and groan around them, occasionally illuminated by lightning strikes that turned the windows into blazing rectangles of blue-white fire. But gradually, as the hours passed and the structure proved its resilience against nature's assault, she began to feel something she hadn't experienced since Robert's death, a sense of being protected rather than merely surviving. Dawn arrived, gray and exhausted, the storm having spent its furies somewhere to the east, leaving behind a landscape transformed by wind and water. The parking lot had become a shallow lake dotted with debris, tree branches, pieces of roofing, a child's bicycle that had traveled from God knows where. But the building had held, and they were alive, and Margaret felt a fierce pride in their makeshift fortress that surprised her with its intensity. The metal surface under the linoleum had haunted her dreams during the brief moments when exhaustion overcame anxiety, and in the morning light filtering through the gaps in the plywood, she found herself drawn back to the anomaly like a moth to flame. The scratches Buster had made revealed more metal underneath, and when Margaret pressed her ear to the surface, she could swear she heard a hollow echo that suggested empty space below. "There's something down there," she told the dogs, who had gathered around her with the patient attention that animals showed when their humans were acting strangely but harmlessly. "The question is, do we have the right to find out what it is?" The moral implications of her growing curiosity weighed heavily on her conscience. She was already trespassing, already using someone else's abandoned property without permission. But the building had been empty for 8 years, according to Bill Henderson, forgotten by an owner who lived back east and probably wrote it off as a tax loss years ago. And there was something about the mystery beneath their feet that called to the part of her that had once been Margaret Chen, the science teacher, the woman who had spent 30 years encouraging children to ask questions and seek answers and never accept the world at face value. She spent the morning exploring their new shelter more thoroughly, cataloging its resources and possibilities. The water still worked in the small bathroom, though the pressure was low and the pipes groaned with age. The electricity had been shut off long ago, but she discovered a generator in the storage room that might work if she could find fuel for it. Most importantly, the building felt solid and secure, a genuine refuge from both weather and the kind of attention that made her skin crawl when strangers drove past their outdoor campsite. But the locked door marked "Employees Only" continued to intrigue her, especially after she noticed that the metal surface under the linoleum seemed to extend in that direction. The lock was old but well made, the kind of sturdy hardware that had protected valuable things for decades. When she pressed her ear to the door, the same hollow echo seemed to emanate from whatever lay beyond, as if the building were whispering secrets that only the desperate were desperate enough to hear. The screwdriver that had served her so well on the plywood proved inadequate against the lock's stubborn mechanism, but Margaret had spent 43 years married to a man who could fix anything with enough patience and the right tools. She searched the storage room more carefully, pushing aside boxes of cleaning supplies and outdated promotional materials, until she found what had once been the station's toolkit, a battered metal box containing wrenches, pliers, and various implements that spoke of an earlier era when gas stations were full-service operations, staffed by people who understood engines and weren't afraid to get their hands dirty.
The lock surrendered to her persistence with a reluctant click that sounded unnaturally loud in the empty building. Margaret hesitated for a moment, acutely aware that she was crossing another line, moving from trespasser to actual criminal with this single act of breaking and entering. But the dogs were watching her with trusting eyes, and the mystery beneath her feet had become an obsession that overrode her remaining scruples about property rights and legal boundaries. The door opened to reveal a narrow staircase leading down into darkness, the steps carved from concrete and worn smooth by decades of foot traffic. The air that rose from below carried a scent that Margaret couldn't immediately identify, not the mustiness of abandonment, but something cleaner and more industrial, as if whatever lay beneath the convenience store had been sealed away from the decay that had claimed the upper levels. "Well, boys," she said, aiming her flashlight down the stairs and seeing nothing but shadows and more concrete. Looks like our little gas station has a basement. Question is, what kind of people build basements under gas stations in the middle of nowhere? Duke whimpered his uncertainty, but Buster was already investigating the top step with his nose, his tail wagging with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested adventure rather than danger. Penny took her usual position in the middle, ready to follow whatever decision Margaret made while keeping both her companions in sight. The descent felt like traveling backward through time, each step taking her further from the familiar world of surface concerns and deeper into mysteries that predated her current crisis. The walls were concrete block, professionally constructed and sealed against moisture in a way that spoke of serious intent rather than amateur effort. About halfway down, she encountered a heavy steel door that stood slightly ajar, its surface unmarked by rust or corrosion, despite what must have been decades of abandonment. Beyond the door lay a corridor lined with more concrete block, illuminated by the weak beam of her flashlight and stretching into darkness that seemed to swallow sound as well as light. The air was noticeably cooler here and dry in a way that suggested climate control systems that might still be functioning despite the building's apparent abandonment. Margaret's footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, creating rhythms that seemed to multiply and overlap until she couldn't tell which sounds were her own and which might be something else moving in the darkness ahead. The corridor ended at another steel door, this one equipped with a wheel lock like something from a submarine or bank vault. The metal was cold under her hands, but when she tried to turn the wheel, it moved with surprising ease, as if it had been maintained and lubricated regularly despite the years of apparent neglect. The door swung open with a soft hiss that suggested air pressure differentials, and Margaret found herself staring into a space that defied every assumption she had made about abandoned gas stations and forgotten pieces of roadside America. The room beyond was enormous, carved from the living rock beneath the Nebraska plains and reinforced with the kind of engineering that suggested government involvement and unlimited budgets. Banks of electronic equipment lined the walls, their LED displays blinking with patient persistence, despite the building above them having lost power years ago. The air hummed with the sound of machinery that never slept, climate control systems and backup generators that had been maintaining this hidden fortress through seasons and years without human oversight. But it was the center of the room that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat and her hands tremble as she struggled to process what her flashlight beam revealed. Stacks of currency were arranged with military precision across a series of tables, each bundle wrapped in plastic and labeled with codes that meant nothing to her, but everything to someone. The money seemed to stretch beyond the reach of her light, piles and rows and carefully organized mountains of cash that represented more wealth than she had ever imagined seeing in one place. "Jesus Christ," she whispered, the words echoing in the vast space like a prayer or a curse. The dogs pressed against her legs, sensing her shock and responding with the protective instincts that had sustained them through their journey from housed to homeless to something else entirely, something she didn't have words for yet.
She moved deeper into the room, her flashlight beam revealing more details that challenged her understanding of reality. This wasn't a simple cache of stolen money, or the kind of survival bunker that paranoid preppers built in their backyards. The sophistication of the equipment, the professional organization of the currency, the sheer scale of the operation suggested something far more complex and dangerous than anything she was equipped to understand or handle. Computer terminals displayed data that scrolled past too quickly to read, but she caught glimpses of financial information, transaction records, account numbers that seemed to represent sums that made her modest Social Security check look like pocket change. Maps covered one wall, marked with pins and routes that connected cities and countries in patterns that suggested global operations rather than local crime. But it was the documents she found in a fireproof filing cabinet that truly terrified her. pages of official-looking paperwork bearing letterheads from government agencies she recognized and others she didn't. The names meant nothing to her, but the amounts discussed in the memos and reports were staggering. Hundreds of millions of dollars flowing through accounts and shell companies in transactions that were clearly never meant to be discovered by ordinary citizens poking around abandoned gas stations with rusty screwdrivers and desperate curiosity. Margaret sank into a chair that had been positioned in front of one of the computer terminals, her legs suddenly unable to support the weight of revelation that pressed down on her like a physical force. She had stumbled into something that belonged to a world she'd never imagined, a shadow economy that operated beneath the surface of ordinary life like some vast underground river carrying wealth and power and secrets that could destroy lives with casual efficiency. "We have to get out of here," she told the dogs, who had positioned themselves strategically around the room, their senses alert to dangers that human perception couldn't detect. "This isn't a treasure, boys. This is trouble with a capital T, and we're way over our heads." But even as she spoke the words, Margaret found herself calculating the implications of what she'd discovered. The money was real. She'd examined enough of the bundles to confirm that, and the amounts were staggering. There had to be over $100 million in this room, maybe twice that, sitting forgotten beneath a gas station that had been abandoned for almost a decade. Whoever had built this place was either dead or in prison or had forgotten it existed, which meant the money was effectively orphaned, waiting for someone desperate enough to claim it. The rational part of her mind screamed warnings about federal crimes and money laundering and the kind of people who built secret bunkers filled with unmarked cash. But the desperate part of her, the part that had been counting pennies and rationing dog food and sleeping in tents behind abandoned buildings, whispered seductive possibilities about veterinary bills and house payments and the simple dignity of having enough money to buy groceries without checking prices. She thought about Duke's arthritis medication, about Penny's developing cough, about Buster's ribs showing through his patchy coat. She thought about her own hunger, the constant gnawing that had become as familiar as breathing, and the way her body was consuming itself to keep functioning. She thought about the eviction notice that had started this whole nightmare, about bank officers with their polite cruelty and debt collectors with their relentless pursuit of money she simply didn't possess.
And she thought about Robert, about the man who had promised to love and protect her until death do them part, who had left her with debts she couldn't pay and a future she couldn't face. Would he forgive her for considering theft on such a massive scale? Would he understand that sometimes survival required moral compromises that civilized people never had to contemplate? The question swirled through her mind like the storm that had driven them into this underground sanctuary, each possibility carrying its own weight of consequence and hope. Above them, the abandoned gas station waited in the morning light, as innocent and forgotten as it had been for 8 years. But beneath the surface, in this hidden world of wealth and machinery and secrets that could reshape everything, Margaret Chen faced the kind of choice that defined not just survival, but the very nature of who she was and who she might become. The dogs watched her with patient eyes, trusting her to make the right decision, even when she wasn't sure what that might be anymore. Outside, the world continued its relentless march toward futures that didn't include broken widows and their loyal companions. But here, in this impossible room filled with more money than she'd ever dreamed of possessing, time seemed suspended, waiting for a choice that would determine whether they emerged from this underground tomb as the same desperate creatures who had entered, or as something else entirely, something that might have a chance at the kind of life she thought was lost forever. Margaret spent 3 sleepless days circling the underground bunker like a moth around a flame that might illuminate her path or consume her entirely. She would descend the concrete steps with her flashlight clutched in trembling hands, stand at the threshold of that impossible room filled with more wealth than most people saw in a lifetime, and then retreat back to the surface world where problems had simpler solutions and moral choices came with clearer guidelines.
The dogs sensed her internal turmoil, following her on these subterranean expeditions with the patient loyalty that had sustained them through their journey from housed to homeless to something else entirely. Something she still couldn't name because naming it would make it real, would transform her from victim of circumstance into active participant in whatever criminal enterprise had built this fortress beneath the Nebraska plains. On the fourth morning, as she sat drinking instant coffee heated over her camping stove and watching Duke struggle to his feet on joints that seemed stiffer each day, Margaret made a decision that felt less like choice than surrender to inevitability. She would take one bundle of cash, just one, enough to buy proper food for the dogs and gas for the Honda, and maybe a week's worth of breathing room while she figured out what came next. It wasn't stealing, she told herself. It was borrowing from people who had clearly forgotten this place existed, taking only what she needed to keep herself and her companions alive until some better solution presented itself. But when she descended into the bunker with a canvas grocery bag and her most desperate rationalizations, Margaret discovered something that shattered her carefully constructed justifications like glass against concrete. Sitting on the desk beside the main computer terminal was a newspaper she hadn't noticed before, the Omaha World-Herald, dated just 3 days ago, folded open to a story that made her blood freeze in her veins despite the climate-controlled air. Federal investigation continues into missing cartel funds, read the headline, and the story that followed painted a picture of international money laundering, drug trafficking, and the kind of people who killed entire families for lesser transgressions than stumbling into their hidden treasure rooms. The article mentioned a joint task force between the FBI and DEA, ongoing investigations into financial networks that span from Mexico to Canada, and rewards being offered for information leading to the recovery of what officials estimated to be over $200 million in missing proceeds from various criminal enterprises. Margaret's hands shook as she read the details, each paragraph adding another layer of terror to her growing understanding of exactly what she had stumbled into. This wasn't abandoned money waiting for someone desperate enough to claim it. This was the operational heart of criminal organizations that treated human life like a business expense and solved problems with the kind of permanent solutions that left families planning funerals instead of futures.
The recent newspaper meant someone had been here recently, someone who belonged to this shadowy world of violence and money and consequences that fell on innocent people like storms from a clear sky. She thought about the building's maintained systems, the climate control that had preserved this underground fortress through years of apparent abandonment, the generators that hummed with reliable persistence despite the surface structure having lost power long ago. None of this had been abandoned at all. It had been waiting, maintained by people who were killed for considerably less provocation than Grand Theft Auto on a scale that would make international headlines. "Jesus, what have we gotten ourselves into?" she whispered to Duke, who had positioned himself between her and the stacks of currency as if his arthritic body could somehow protect her from the implications of their discovery. The German shepherd's cloudy eyes held wisdom that transcended species, and she could swear she saw Robert's gentle warning in that steady gaze, the same expression he'd worn when she'd wanted to confront their neighbors about their barking dog, the same patient concern that had kept her from making enemies of people who might have made their lives difficult. But it was too late for caution now. She had already broken into the building, already descended into depths that were never meant to be discovered by ordinary citizens with flashlights and empty stomachs. Her fingerprints were on surfaces throughout the bunker, her DNA scattered across a crime scene that would eventually draw the attention of people who solved problems with bullets rather than lawyers. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She couldn't leave. Not anymore. The moment she had descended those concrete steps and opened that bolt-like door, she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Whether she took the money or not, whether she reported her discovery to authorities or fled the state entirely, she was now part of this story, a loose end that needed to be tied off before it could unravel whatever larger operation this bunker served. Margaret sank into the chair beside the computer terminal, her mind racing through possibilities that all led to the same terrifying conclusion.
If she reported the bunker to law enforcement, she would become a witness in a federal investigation involving the kind of people who eliminated witnesses with professional efficiency. If she tried to flee, she would be a fugitive carrying knowledge that made her more valuable dead than alive. And if she stayed silent and pretended she had never found this place, she would be living on borrowed time until the people who maintained this facility realized their security had been compromised. The dog settled around her chair with the patience of creatures who had learned to wait while their human processed information that was too complex for simple solutions. Duke's breathing had become more labored in recent days, and Penny's cough had worsened, but Buster remained alert and optimistic, his tail wagging whenever Margaret looked in his direction. They trusted her to make the right decisions, to keep them safe in a world that had become increasingly hostile to creatures who couldn't pay their own way. "What would you do, Robert?" she asked the empty air, hoping for some whisper of guidance from a man who had always known how to navigate moral complexity without compromising his essential decency. But the bunker remained silent, except for the hum of machinery that never slept, and Margaret was alone with choices that had no good outcomes, only varying degrees of catastrophe. She spent the morning exploring the bunker more systematically, searching for clues about who built this place and when they might return. The file cabinets yielded documents in multiple languages, financial records that traced money through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts, communications between people who used code names and spoke in euphemisms that barely concealed discussions of murder and mayhem. One folder contained photographs of people she didn't recognize, men and women whose faces had been marked with red X's that suggested they were no longer active participants in whatever enterprise this facility served. But the security system that truly terrified her, banks of monitors connected to cameras that she realized must be hidden throughout the building and surrounding area. When she managed to activate one of the terminals, the password was written on a piece of tape stuck to the monitor, suggesting either supreme confidence or dangerous carelessness. She discovered that her every movement had been recorded from the moment she first climbed through the loose plywood window.
Hours of footage showed her exploring the building, settling in with the dogs, descending into the bunker with growing curiosity and mounting dread. The cameras had captured everything, from her desperate attempts to create shelter, to her shocking discovery of the money, to her current investigation of systems she was never meant to access. If someone was monitoring these feeds remotely, they already knew about the breach. If they were only checked periodically, she might have days or weeks before her presence was discovered. The computer system revealed other secrets that painted an increasingly terrifying picture of the forces she had inadvertently challenged. Bank account numbers in the Cayman Islands, shipping manifests for containers that moved through ports from Long Beach to Miami, personnel files for people whose job descriptions included phrases like asset protection and problem resolution that made Margaret's skin crawl with their clinical euphemisms for violence. One file contained what appeared to be a complete dossier on the gas station itself, including architectural drawings that showed the bunker's construction, maintenance schedules for the various systems, and a timeline that suggested the facility had been active as recently as 6 months ago. The surface building's abandonment was clearly deliberate camouflage, a way to hide the bunker's continued operation beneath the appearance of ordinary rural decay. But the most chilling discovery was a communication log that showed regular check-ins from someone identified only as maintenance, with the most recent entry dated just 2 weeks ago. The messages were brief and professional. Systems operational, facility secure. Next inspection is scheduled for month-end. Margaret checked the calendar on her phone and felt her heart sink like a stone. The month-end was less than a week away. She printed out what documents she could, though doing so felt like collecting evidence for her own prosecution.
and tucked them into her jacket with hands that trembled like leaves in a storm. The dogs watched her movements with growing concern, their animal instincts recognizing signs of distress that transcended species boundaries. They had followed her into this nightmare, trusting her judgment even when it led them into situations that defied their understanding of how the world was supposed to work. The sound of a vehicle approaching sent Margaret's heart into overdrive, the familiar rumble of a truck engine penetrating the bunker's soundproofing with enough clarity to identify it as the same pickup that Bill Henderson had driven during his earlier visit. She killed the lights in the bunker and climbed the stairs as quickly as her shaking legs would carry her, emerging into the convenience store just as Duke began his low warning growl that meant strangers were approaching their territory. Through the gaps in the plywood covering the windows, she could see Bill climbing out of his truck with the unhurried movements of a man who belonged in this landscape. But there was something different about his posture today, an alertness that hadn't been present during their first encounter. And when he called out his greeting, his voice carried an undertone that made Margaret's already frayed nerves snap tight with new anxiety. "Margaret, you folks still doing all right in there?" She emerged from the building with what she hoped was a casual expression, acutely aware that Bill's eyes were taking inventory of changes since his last visit. The loose plywood that marked her entry point, the camping equipment that had been moved inside, the general signs of more permanent habitation that transformed her from traveling vagrant to squatter with potential criminal implications.
"We're fine," she managed, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect. "Storm the other night convinced us to move inside. Hope that's not a problem." Bill's smile seemed genuine, but Margaret noticed the way his gaze lingered on details that a casual visitor shouldn't care about: the tool marks on the plywood, the scratches around the door lock, the general signs of forced entry that could land her in jail if reported to the wrong authorities. "Course not," he said. "Figured you'd end up inside eventually. This old place has kept a lot of folks dry over the years." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her wonder how much he actually knew about the woman camping on his neighbor's forgotten property. "Mind if I ask what you did before retirement? You've got the look of someone who spent time solving problems." The question caught her off guard, partially because it suggested he'd been thinking about her background, but mostly because it reminded her of who she used to be before poverty and desperation stripped away everything except the basic animal need to survive. "I was a teacher," she said. "High school science. 30 years in the classroom before budget cuts made me redundant." "Science teacher," Bill repeated, and something in his tone suggested the information was significant in ways she couldn't fathom. "That explains the curiosity. Always asking questions, always looking for answers, even when the questions might be dangerous." Margaret felt ice forming in her veins despite the afternoon heat. "I'm not sure what you mean." Bill stepped closer, his movements still unhurried but somehow more purposeful, and Margaret noticed for the first time that his work clothes were cleaner than they should be for a man coming from farm chores, his hands softer than decades of honest labor should have left them. "Found something interesting during your explorations, didn't you? Something that's got you asking questions about the kind of people who build basements under gas stations in the middle of nowhere." The world seemed to tilt sideways as Margaret realized that Bill Henderson wasn't the kindly neighbor she'd assumed him to be, that his casual visits and gentle concern had been something else entirely. Surveillance disguised as compassion, monitoring disguised as mercy. The dogs sensed the shift in atmosphere, Duke struggling to his feet with a growl that spoke of protective instincts that transcended his physical limitations, while Penny and Buster positioned themselves between their human and this stranger who had suddenly revealed himself as something far more dangerous than a sympathetic farmer.
I don't know what you're talking about, Margaret said, but her voice carried the telltale tremor of someone whose lies were crumbling faster than she could construct them. Bill's expression shifted to something that might have been sympathy, if not for the cold calculation behind his eyes. Margaret, I've been watching this place for 8 years, making sure nobody discovered what they weren't supposed to discover. You're not the first desperate person to take shelter here, but you are the first one curious enough to go poking around in locked doors and sealed basements. That makes you a problem I'm going to have to solve, one way or another. The admission hung in the air between them like a death sentence, and Margaret felt the last of her illusions about innocent coincidence and random kindness evaporate into the harsh Nebraska sunshine. She had stumbled into a web of criminal conspiracy that stretched far beyond this forgotten gas station, had been watched and evaluated by people who made their living ensuring that certain secrets remained buried beneath the surface of ordinary American life. But even as terror threatened to paralyze her completely, Margaret felt something else rising in her chest. Not hope exactly, but the kind of desperate fury that had sustained human beings through impossible circumstances since the beginning of recorded history. She had lost her husband, her home, her dignity, and most of her illusions about the fundamental fairness of existence. But she still had her dogs, and she still had whatever remained of the person she used to be before desperation taught her that survival sometimes required moral compromises that civilized people never had to contemplate.
"So what happens now?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "You kill an old woman and 3 dogs because we found something we weren't supposed to find." Bill's laugh held no humor, only the weary resignation of a man who had solved similar problems many times before. "Nothing that dramatic, but you're gonna have to come with me, Margaret. There are people who need to talk to you about what you've seen, people who will decide what kind of problem you represent and what kind of solution you require." The dogs pressed closer to her legs, their warmth a reminder that some loyalties transcended fear and some bonds couldn't be broken by threats or violence. Whatever happened next, whatever choice she made in the next few seconds, Margaret knew she would not abandon the creatures who had followed her into this nightmare with the kind of trust that humans rarely showed each other. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the abandoned gas station in shades of amber and gold that made it look almost beautiful despite the terror unfolding in its shadow. Soon darkness would fall across the Nebraska plains, and Margaret Chen would discover whether the choices she'd made in desperation would lead to redemption or destruction. Whether the love she felt for 3 loyal dogs would be enough to sustain her through whatever came next in this story that had started with eviction notices and ended with secrets that people killed to protect. Margaret looked into Bill Henderson's cold eyes and made a calculation that had nothing to do with mathematics and everything to do with the kind of desperate courage that emerged when people realized they had absolutely nothing left to lose. She was 72 years old, broke, homeless, and facing men who solved problems with violence as casual as other people chose breakfast cereals. But she was also a former science teacher who had spent 30 years encouraging children to ask dangerous questions, and she was the human guardian of 3 dogs who trusted her to make decisions that kept them alive, even when survival seemed impossible. "Before I go anywhere with you," she said, her voice carrying the authority she'd once used to silence rowdy teenagers, "I want to know what's really in that bunker. Not just the money. I've figured out it belongs to people who kill for less than what I've stumbled into. But there's more down there, isn't there? Equipment that's too sophisticated for simple money laundering.
systems that require the kind of maintenance that suggests ongoing operations. Bill's expression shifted to something that might have been respect if it weren't tainted by the certainty of her impending death. "You really were a teacher, weren't you? Can't help but keep asking questions even when the answers are going to get you killed. I've been dying slowly for months. Starvation, exposure, the kind of poverty that grinds people down one unpaid bill at a time. At least this way, I'll die knowing something worth knowing instead of just fading away in some county shelter where they warehouse old people who've outlived their usefulness." The admission hung between them like a challenge, and Margaret watched Bill process the implications of a woman who had already accepted her mortality and was therefore considerably more dangerous than someone still clinging to hope for survival. She had learned something important during her months of homelessness. When you had nothing left to protect, you became capable of actions that terrified people who still had something to lose. "The bunker isn't just storage," Bill said finally, his tone carrying the reluctant respect that professionals sometimes showed for worthy opponents. "It's a distribution hub for an operation that moves money from Mexico to Chicago, launders it through a network of legitimate businesses, and sends it back south as clean investment capital. The gas station was perfect cover, remote enough to avoid casual inspection, positioned on highways that drug runners have used for decades, abandoned enough that local law enforcement never bothered to check on it."
Margaret nodded as if this confirmation of her suspicions was simply another piece of data to be processed and filed away. But inside, her mind was racing through implications and possibilities that a lifetime of teaching high school science had prepared her to recognize. The operation Bill described required sophisticated logistics, reliable communications, and the kind of institutional knowledge that didn't simply evaporate when key personnel were arrested or killed. "How long has it been running?" she asked. 12 years. Started small, just a way station for cash moving north. But the people who built it were smart. They automated everything they could, compartmentalized the operation so no single person could bring down the entire network. Even me, I just maintain security for this one facility. I don't know who runs the larger operation, don't want to know. That kind of knowledge gets you killed faster than stumbling into places you don't belong. Margaret felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with the satisfying precision of a well-designed experiment yielding expected results. But something's changed recently, hasn't it? All that equipment, those computers running financial models and tracking transactions, someone's been using artificial intelligence to manage the money laundering. That's why the facility can run with minimal human oversight, why it survived even when key personnel were eliminated or imprisoned. Bill stared at her with the kind of amazement that suggested he'd never encountered a homeless woman who could deduce the operational structure of a criminal conspiracy from scattered observations and educated guesswork. "Jesus Christ, you really are dangerous." Yes, the whole thing runs on algorithms now. AI systems that can process financial data faster than human accountants, identify optimal laundering routes, even predict law enforcement patterns and adjust operations accordingly. The revelation hit Margaret like an electric shock, not because it surprised her, but because it confirmed her growing suspicion that she had stumbled into something far more significant than a simple cache of criminal proceeds. She was looking at the future of organized crime, a prototype for operations that could function independently of human oversight and therefore survive the kind of prosecutorial pressure that had historically disrupted major criminal enterprises. "And now you have to kill me because I figured out what you're really running here? Not just because I found the money, but because I understand the technology. Because I'm smart enough to explain to federal investigators exactly how your AI systems work and how to shut them down."
Bill's hand moved to his jacket in a gesture that Margaret recognized from movies and television shows, though experiencing it in person carried a visceral impact that no fictional representation could capture. But before he could complete whatever action he'd intended, Duke stepped forward with a growl that seemed to emerge from depths of protective fury that transcended his physical limitations. The old German shepherd was clearly dying, his breathing labored, his movements stiff with pain, his cloudy eyes struggling to focus on threats that existed in a world growing dimmer by the day. But he positioned himself between Margaret and Bill with the kind of absolute determination that had made his breed legendary among people who understood the true meaning of loyalty. Penny and Buster flanked him, 3 dogs forming a defensive line that would have been touching if it weren't so completely futile against armed men who solve problems with professional efficiency. "Here's what's going to happen," Margaret said, her voice carrying the same tone she'd used when explaining complex scientific principles to students who thought they were too stupid to understand. "You're going to let me walk back into that building and gather my things. My dogs and I are going to get in my car and drive away from here, and we're never going to speak of what we found. Because killing us would create exactly the kind of attention that your operation has spent 12 years avoiding."
Bill laughed, but the sound carried an edge of hysteria that suggested he was beginning to recognize the impossible situation Margaret had created. "You think anyone's going to miss a homeless woman and 3 dogs? You think anyone's going to investigate when you just disappear? I think you've been watching me for days, which means you know I'm not just some random vagrant," Margaret replied. "You know I was a teacher, which means there are records of my employment, pension files that show I should be receiving Social Security checks. When those checks stop being cashed, when my bank account goes dormant, someone's going to notice. And when they start investigating, they're going to discover that the last place Margaret Chen was seen alive was at an abandoned gas station that's been under federal surveillance as part of a major money laundering investigation." The bluff was audacious enough to be believed, built on fragments of truth that Bill couldn't verify without revealing more about his own knowledge than operational security would allow. Margaret had no way of knowing whether federal agents were actually watching the facility, but the newspaper article she'd found suggested active investigations, and Bill's reaction told her that her guess had struck closer to truth than she dared hope. "Besides," she continued, pressing her advantage while her voice still held steady, "you said yourself that the operation is compartmentalized. You don't know who runs the larger network, which means you can't authorize executive decisions like eliminating witnesses. That kind of choice has to be made by people considerably higher up the food chain, people who are going to want to evaluate the risk I represent before deciding how to handle me." Bill's hesitation confirmed what Margaret had suspected. He was security, not management, trained to handle routine problems, but not equipped to make strategic decisions about threats that fell outside normal parameters. She represented something unprecedented, a homeless woman smart enough to understand the sophistication of their operation, desperate enough to be unpredictable, and elderly enough that killing her would create the kind of attention that sophisticated criminal enterprises spent enormous resources avoiding. "You're proposing what, exactly?" Bill asked, his tone suggesting he was genuinely curious about her solution to their mutual problem. "I'm proposing that you let me disappear properly. Give me enough money to start over somewhere far away, somewhere I can rent a little apartment that allows dogs and buy groceries without counting pennies. In exchange, I forget everything I saw here. The bunker, the money, the AI systems, all of it disappears from my memory like it never existed." The negotiation felt surreal, like something from a movie where desperate people made bargains with devils who wore human faces and spoke in reasonable tones about unreasonable things. But Margaret had learned during her months of homelessness that survival often required exactly this kind of moral flexibility, the willingness to find a middle ground between principles and pragmatism when absolute positions led to absolute destruction. Bill was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing implications and calculating risks that went far beyond Margaret's understanding of the larger criminal enterprise she'd inadvertently threatened. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone making decisions that would have consequences for many people beyond the participants in this impossible conversation. "How much money are we talking about?" Margaret felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized that her desperate gamble might actually work, that she might walk away from this nightmare with her life and her dogs and enough resources to disappear into the kind of anonymous middle-class existence that seemed impossibly luxurious after months of counting pennies and sleeping in tents. $50,000, she said, the number emerging from calculations she'd made during sleepless nights in the bunker, adding up veterinarian bills and apartment deposits and the simple cost of dignity that came with having enough money to pay for basic necessities. 50,000, Bill repeated, as if testing the weight of the sum against the magnitude of the problem she represented. It's a rounding error compared to what's in that bunker, but taking it creates paperwork, requires explanations to people who don't like explaining things to federal investigators.
"Then don't take it from the bunker," Margaret said, surprising herself with the speed of her tactical thinking. "You've been maintaining this facility for 8 years, which means you have access to operational funds for legitimate expenses. Security consultant fees, building maintenance, equipment upgrades. There are dozens of ways to justify $50,000 in payments to someone who helped secure a compromised facility." Bill stared at her with the kind of amazement that suggested he'd never encountered a homeless woman who could improvise money laundering strategies faster than some professional accountants. "You really should have been working for us instead of against us. That kind of thinking would have been valuable in the right circumstances." "I was busy teaching teenagers about the scientific method," Margaret replied. "Same principles, different applications. Observe, hypothesize, test, adapt. The only difference is that when your experiments fail in criminal enterprises, people die instead of just getting bad grades." The sun had continued its descent toward the western horizon while they negotiated the terms of her survival, and now the abandoned gas station was bathed in the golden light that made even the most desolate landscapes look beautiful for a few precious minutes before darkness claimed them. Margaret could hear Penny's labored breathing, could see Duke struggling to maintain his protective stance despite joints that screamed with every movement. Whatever decision Bill made in the next few minutes would determine whether these loyal creatures spent their final days in comfort or died alongside her in this forgotten corner of Nebraska where dreams came to die. "All right," Bill said finally, his tone suggesting he'd reached a decision that violated several operational protocols but represented the least dangerous solution to an unprecedented problem. $50,000 transferred to an account you'll establish in whatever city you choose for your relocation. But there are conditions." Margaret nodded, hardly daring to believe that her desperate negotiation had actually succeeded, that she might emerge from this nightmare with enough resources to provide proper care for the creatures who had followed her into hell with absolute trust in her ability to find a way out. "You disappear completely. New city, new identity if necessary, no contact with anyone from your previous life. You become someone else, someone who never lived in Nebraska and never stumbled into places she didn't belong. And if you ever surface again, if you ever try to tell this story or contact law enforcement or write a book about your adventures, you and your dogs will die in ways that make tonight's conversation look like a pleasant social visit." The threat carried the casual certainty of someone who had delivered similar ultimatums many times before, but Margaret found herself nodding agreement because the alternative was immediate death rather than hypothetical future consequences. She had bought time and resources with her desperate gamble, had transformed herself from victim into negotiating partner through a combination of intelligence, desperation, and the kind of courage that emerged when people realized they had nothing left to lose except the creatures they loved most. As Bill walked back to his truck to make the phone calls that would authorize her survival and arrange the financial transactions that would fund her disappearance, Margaret knelt beside her dogs and buried her face in Duke's graying fur. The old German shepherd's tail moved weakly against the ground, and she could feel his heart beating with the steady rhythm that had sustained him through their impossible journey from eviction notice to criminal conspiracy to whatever came next.
"We did it, boys," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotions she'd held in check throughout their negotiation with death. "We're going to survive this. We're going to find somewhere warm and safe, somewhere with veterinarians and dog parks and neighbors who don't solve problems with bullets. We're going to have the kind of life I thought was lost forever."
The stars were beginning to emerge in the vast Nebraska sky as Margaret Chen sat beside an abandoned gas station and contemplated the strange turns that had brought her to this moment. She had lost her husband, her home, her savings, and most of her illusions about the fundamental fairness of existence. But she had gained something else, the knowledge that desperation could transform ordinary people into forces of nature, that love could motivate actions that logic would have deemed impossible, and that sometimes the end of one story was simply the beginning of another, stranger and more wonderful than anything she could have imagined when she still believed that home was a place you paid for, rather than a feeling you carried inside your heart. 18 months later, Margaret Ellen Richardson, she had chosen the name carefully, keeping her initials but abandoning the surname that connected her to a life that officially no longer existed, sat on the covered patio of her small adobe house in Tucson, Arizona, watching Duke sleep in a patch of late afternoon sunshine that slanted through the mesquite trees in her backyard. The old German shepherd's breathing was easier now, his arthritis managed with medication she could finally afford, his remaining days measured not in survival, but in comfort. The transformation had been gradual, like watching a photograph develop in the dark room of her high school science lab, details emerging slowly from chemical baths until the image became clear and recognizable. The woman who had counted pennies at gas station pumps and slept in tents behind abandoned buildings felt like someone she had known in passing, a character from a story she had read rather than lived. But the memories remained vivid, particularly during the quiet hours before dawn when the desert whispered secrets to anyone patient enough to listen. Penny stretched beside her chair, the golden retriever mix's coat gleaming with health that came from regular grooming and nutritious food, and the kind of veterinary care that transformed aging from suffering into a gentle decline toward dignified rest. Her cough had disappeared within weeks of their arrival in Arizona, the dry air proving therapeutic for respiratory problems that Nebraska's humid summers had aggravated. She was 13 now, moving more slowly but with the contentment of a creature who had found her place in the world and intended to enjoy it for whatever time remained. Buster had adapted to their new life with the enthusiasm of a terrier who had discovered that yards could be claimed as territory and neighbors could be trained to offer treats in exchange for enthusiastic greetings. At 11, he retained the energy of a much younger dog, his one remaining ear cocked perpetually forward as he monitored the activities of roadrunners and javelinas and the various other desert creatures who had accepted him as a harmless addition to their ancient landscape. The house itself was modest. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a living area that opened onto the covered patio where Margaret spent most of her time reading and thinking and processing the extraordinary sequence of events that had brought her from eviction notice to this sanctuary in the Sonoran Desert. The rent was reasonable, the landlord indifferent to tenants who paid promptly and maintained their properties, the neighbors friendly enough to wave in passing but respectful of privacy in the way that people who had chosen to live on the edges of cities understood without explanation. She had become Ellen Richardson gradually, establishing the identity with the methodical precision that 30 years of teaching had instilled in her approach to complex problems. Bank accounts opened with cash deposits that raised no suspicions when divided across multiple institutions. A social security number that belonged to a woman who died in childhood, purchased from the kind of document specialists who served people needing to disappear for reasons that weren't always criminal. A driver's license obtained through legitimate channels using documentation that would survive casual inspection, but wouldn't withstand the kind of scrutiny that federal investigators brought to bear on subjects of serious interest. The $50,000 had been transferred exactly as promised, appearing in her account through a series of transactions that looked like consulting fees for computer security services rendered to a company that existed primarily in cyberspace and regulatory filings. Bill Henderson, if that was even his real name, had kept his word, with the professionalism that characterized successful criminal enterprises. She had never heard from him again, never received so much as a postcard confirming that her relocation had been successful and her silence maintained. But she thought about him sometimes, wondered if he was still maintaining security for a bunker that had probably been relocated or upgraded in the months since her discovery. The newspaper articles she read carefully but sporadically suggested that federal investigations into cartel money laundering continued with mixed success, occasional arrests and seizures that disrupted operations temporarily but never seemed to eliminate the larger networks that adapted and evolved like biological systems responding to environmental pressure. Margaret had kept her promise to forget what she had seen, at least officially. But forgetting and understanding were different cognitive processes, and her mind continued to work on the puzzle of artificial intelligence applications in criminal enterprises like background software running calculations that would never produce actionable results. She had stumbled into the future of organized crime, had seen prototype systems that would eventually transform illegal enterprises the way computers had revolutionized legitimate businesses in previous decades. The knowledge was fascinating and terrifying in equal measure, but it belonged to a world she had left behind when she chose survival over principle and pragmatism over the kind of moral absolutism that got homeless widows killed in forgotten corners of Nebraska. She was Ellen Richardson now, a retired woman who had moved to Arizona for her health and the comfort of her aging dogs. Someone whose most dangerous adventure involved hiking desert trails and attending community college courses in subjects that interested her. The local community college had welcomed her as an audit student, allowing her to sit in on chemistry and biology classes taught by professors young enough to be her children, but respectful enough to recognize that learning was a lifelong process that didn't end when people stopped earning paychecks. She had avoided computer science courses, not from lack of interest, but from awareness that her questions might reveal knowledge that respectable widows weren't supposed to possess about advanced artificial intelligence applications. Instead, she had focused on desert ecology, astronomy, and the kind of natural sciences that connected her to the landscape that had become her refuge. The Sonoran Desert was ancient in ways that made human concerns seem ephemeral, its rhythms measured in geological time rather than the frantic pace of modern existence. Saguaro cacti that had been growing when her grandparents were children continued their patient accumulation of mass and height, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding in their shadows. Margaret had learned to read the desert's subtle communications, the way morning light revealed animal tracks in sandy washes, the seasonal migrations of birds that connected Arctic breeding grounds to tropical wintering areas, the complex relationships between plants and pollinators that had evolved over millions of years without requiring human management or intervention. It was science stripped from technology's complications, biology functioning according to principles that predated artificial intelligence and criminal conspiracies and all the other innovations that humans had created to complicate simple problems. Her days had developed a rhythm that felt sustainable for the first time since Robert's death. Morning coffee on the patio while watching the sunrise paint the Catalina Mountains in shades of rose and gold that never repeated exactly but always inspired wonder. Breakfast shared with 3 dogs whose appetites had returned along with their sense of security. Mid-morning walks along desert trails that wound through landscapes so alien to Nebraska's farmland that she sometimes felt like an astronaut exploring distant planets where different rules governed the relationship between survival and beauty.
Afternoons were for reading, mystery novels and popular science books, and the occasional memoir by women who had reinvented themselves after catastrophic life changes.
She had developed a particular appreciation for stories about resilience and adaptation, tales of people who had faced impossible circumstances and found ways not just to survive, but to flourish in environments that would have destroyed less flexible personalities. Evenings belonged to the dogs, and dinner, and the gradual cooling that made Arizona summers bearable for creatures evolved in more temperate climates. She had installed a misting system on the patio, and they would sit together in the artificially cooled air while Margaret processed the day's experiences and planned tomorrow's modest adventures. Sometimes neighbors would stop by. Maria from next door, who taught ESL classes at the community college, or Bob from across the street, who maintained aircraft engines for a regional airline and understood the satisfaction that came from keeping complex systems functioning properly. But the conversations remained surface level. Friendly exchanges about weather and local events, and shared observations about desert wildlife. Margaret had learned to deflect personal questions with the skill of someone who had genuine reasons for privacy, offering enough information to seem forthcoming while revealing nothing that could connect Ellen Richardson to Margaret Chen or the extraordinary circumstances that had funded her comfortable retirement. The loneliness was manageable, partly because she had the dogs, but mostly because solitude felt like a luxury after months of desperation when every human interaction carried the potential for judgment, rejection, or worse. She had learned to enjoy her own company again, to find satisfaction in activities that didn't require external validation or approval. Reading challenging books, solving crossword puzzles, maintaining a small garden where tomatoes and peppers thrived despite the desert's harsh reputation. Money remained a conscious consideration, but no longer a source of constant anxiety. The $50,000 had been invested conservatively, generating modest returns that supplemented the Social Security benefits that Ellen Richardson received under her carefully constructed identity. She wasn't wealthy, but she was secure in ways that transcended financial calculations. Her dogs had excellent veterinary care, her rent was affordable, her refrigerator remained stocked with food that she chose based on preference rather than price. Sometimes, late at night, when sleep eluded her and the desert's silence pressed against the windows like a living thing, Margaret would remember the bunker beneath a Nebraska gas station. She would think about the millions of dollars stacked with military precision, the sophisticated computer systems managing transactions that funded violence and corruption across international borders, the people who had built systems smart enough to function without constant human oversight. But those memories felt increasingly abstract, like scenes from a movie she had watched rather than experiences she had lived. The woman who had descended those concrete stairs with a flashlight and desperate curiosity seemed like someone else entirely, someone braver and more reckless than Ellen Richardson could ever afford to be. That woman had made choices that saved her life and the lives of her companions, but she had also made bargains with devils who wore human faces and spoke in reasonable tones about unreasonable things. Ellen Richardson was different. More cautious, more aware of the hidden complexities that lurked beneath ordinary surfaces, more grateful for simple pleasures that didn't require moral compromises or negotiations with people who solved problems through violence. She was who Margaret Chen might have become if different choices had been available, if poverty and desperation hadn't forced her to discover exactly how far she was willing to go to protect the creatures she loved most.
Duke's breathing had become more labored as autumn approached, his mobility declining despite the expensive medications that managed his arthritis and the gentle massages that Margaret administered twice daily, with oils recommended by a holistic veterinarian who understood that quality of life mattered more than quantity when dealing with geriatric animals. They had discussed end-of-life care with the same careful attention to detail that Margaret had once applied to lesson planning, ensuring that Duke's final days would be comfortable and dignified, regardless of how the cancer that had begun growing in his liver ultimately progressed. The conversations were difficult but necessary, acknowledgments that love sometimes required the courage to let go when holding on became selfish rather than protective. Margaret had made arrangements with a veterinarian who made house calls, who understood that some goodbyes needed to happen in familiar surroundings with favored people and comfortable furniture, rather than in sterile clinical environments that smelled of disinfectant and fear. But those decisions remained hypothetical for now. Contingencies planned but not yet implemented. Duke still enjoyed his morning sunshine, still wagged his tail when Margaret appeared with food bowls, still positioned himself protectively between his family and strangers who approached their territory with uncertain intentions. He was dying, but he was dying at home, surrounded by creatures who had shared impossible adventures and survived to tell tales that would never be told except in the private conversations that passed between species who had learned to trust each other completely. On good days, Margaret could almost believe that their journey from Nebraska to Arizona was nothing more than an unusual retirement story, a tale of a widow who had chosen adventure over safety and been rewarded with exactly the kind of life she had never dared to dream possible. The money that funded their comfortable existence came from investments and careful planning rather than desperate negotiations with criminals who laundered drug proceeds through artificial intelligence systems that operated beyond traditional law enforcement capabilities. But on difficult days, when memories of hunger and homelessness pressed against her consciousness like ghosts demanding acknowledgement, Margaret remembered the weight of that bunker's secrets and the price she had paid for survival. She had purchased her current life with silence about crimes that continue to operate beyond the reach of authorities who lacked the technological sophistication to understand what they were really fighting. She was complicit now, not through active participation, but through passive acceptance of benefits derived from activities that destroyed communities and funded violence on scales that individual conscience couldn't meaningfully address. The moral complexity kept her awake sometimes, ethical questions that had no clean answers and philosophical problems that couldn't be resolved through good intentions or retroactive charity. She had survived by making pragmatic choices that violated principles she had once considered absolute, had discovered that survival sometimes required exactly the kind of moral flexibility that civilized societies discouraged in their citizens. But she had also learned that love could motivate actions that transcended conventional morality, that loyalty to creatures who depended on her completely had been worth whatever compromises she had made with forces beyond her understanding or control. Duke and Penny and Buster were alive and comfortable because she had been willing to negotiate with devils, to accept money that came from sources she couldn't examine too closely, to become someone else entirely in order to protect the only family she had left. As winter approached and the desert temperatures became comfortable for extended outdoor activities, Margaret began planning hiking trips to places she had only read about in guidebooks and websites. Saguaro National Park, the Desert Museum, mountain trails that would challenge her aging body but reward her with vistas that photographers spend lifetimes trying to capture properly. The dogs were still capable of modest adventures, though she would need to adjust distances and rest stops to accommodate their declining stamina and Duke's increasingly fragile condition.
But they would go together, as they had traveled from Nebraska desperation to Arizona comfort, as they had descended into underground bunkers and emerged into desert sunshine, as they had learned that family wasn't defined by species or legal documents, but by the willingness to face impossible circumstances together and find ways not just to survive, but to flourish despite everything that logic suggested should have destroyed them completely. The sun was setting now, painting the desert sky in shades of amber and rose that made even Margaret's modest backyard look like something from a travel magazine. Roadrunners called to each other from hidden perches in the mesquite trees, their voices carrying messages that predated human language, but conveyed meanings that transcended the need for words. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote pack began their evening song, harmonies that spoke of territory and family, and the ancient rhythms that governed life in places where survival depended on adaptation rather than domination. Margaret Ellen Richardson sat with her 3 dogs and watched the stars emerge in the vast Arizona sky.
each point of light a reminder that some things endured no matter how dark the world became. But as peaceful as this moment felt, she knew their story was far from over. 2 years later. The knock on Margaret's door came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered with the kind of measured persistence that suggested official business rather than neighborly visits. Duke had been gone for 8 months now, his final days spent in the sunshine he had loved, his passing as gentle as Margaret could make it with the help of veterinarians who understood that dignity mattered more than duration when it came to saying goodbye to creatures who had shared impossible adventures. Penny and Buster had grieved in the way that animals do, with quiet acceptance that transcended human understanding of loss. But their pack had been diminished, their sense of security altered by the absence of the German shepherd who had appointed their protector through months of homelessness and years of comfortable retirement. They were slower now, more cautious, content to spend their days in patches of sunlight rather than exploring desert trails that had once called to their adventurous spirits. Margaret opened the door to find a woman in her 40s, professionally dressed, but carrying herself with the kind of casual authority that suggested law enforcement rather than sales or religious outreach. Her smile was pleasant but didn't reach her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice carried the neutral tone that trained investigators used when gathering information from subjects who might or might not be cooperative. "Ellen Richardson?" "Yes." Margaret's response was steady despite the ice that had begun forming in her veins. She had always known this moment might come, had prepared for it during sleepless nights when memories of underground bunkers and criminal negotiations pressed against her consciousness like unwelcome visitors demanding acknowledgement. "I'm Special Agent Sarah Chen with the FBI Financial Crimes Division. I was wondering if we could talk for a few minutes about your background, particularly your time in Nebraska, before relocating to Arizona." The surname hit Margaret like a physical blow, though she managed to keep her expression neutral through decades of experience managing classroom crises that required calm responses to chaotic situations. Chen was a common name, she told herself, especially among federal agents whose families had immigrated from various Asian countries over the past century. But the coincidence felt too pointed to be accidental, too specifically targeted to be the result of random assignment. "Of course," Margaret said, stepping aside to allow the agent entry while her mind raced through possibilities and contingencies. "Though I have to say my life before Arizona wasn't particularly interesting. Retired teacher, lost my husband to cancer, decided I needed a change of scenery for my health and the comfort of my dogs." Agent Chen settled into the living room chair that Margaret indicated, her gaze taking inventory of details that seemed innocuous, but probably weren't. The quality of the furniture, the veterinary certificates on the wall indicating expensive medical care for geriatric animals, the general signs of financial comfort that might or might not align with the pension income that Ellen Richardson should be received.
"I understand completely," Agent Chen said. "Major life changes can be overwhelming, especially when they involve relocating across multiple state lines. But we're actually interested in a specific property you may have encountered during your travels, an abandoned gas station on Route 47, about 30 miles outside of Millbrook, Nebraska." Margaret felt the careful construction of her new identity beginning to crumble like sandcastles before an incoming tide, but she maintained the expression of polite confusion that retired teachers had perfected through decades of dealing with administrative investigations and parental complaints about grades that weren't earned through actual academic achievement. "I'm sorry, but I don't recall any specific gas stations. When you're driving cross-country with 3 dogs, you stop at a lot of places for fuel and rest breaks. Most of them blur together after a while, especially the abandoned ones that dot rural highways throughout the Midwest."
Agent Chen nodded as if this response was expected and entirely reasonable, but Margaret noticed the way her eyes continued cataloging details that would eventually be included in reports that could destroy the careful life she had constructed in the Arizona desert. The agent was building a case, not conducting a casual interview, which meant they already knew more than they were revealing. Of course, but this particular location is significant because it's been under federal surveillance as part of an ongoing investigation into money laundering operations connected to Mexican drug cartels. We have reason to believe that someone with your background, specifically someone with advanced knowledge of computer systems and artificial intelligence applications, may have accessed secure areas of the facility. The accusation hung between them like a challenge, and Margaret realized that her desperate gamble with Bill Henderson had provided temporary safety at the cost of permanent scrutiny. Federal investigators were patient in ways that transcended human lifespans, capable of pursuing leads through decades of bureaucratic persistence until they achieved results that justified their methodical approach to complex criminal enterprises. "I'm flattered that you think I have advanced knowledge of computer systems," Margaret said, allowing a slight smile to soften her response. "But I taught high school biology and chemistry for 30 years. My technical expertise extends to operating a microscope and balancing chemical equations, not infiltrating sophisticated criminal operations." "Actually, Ms. Richardson, or should I call you Ms. Chen, our investigation suggests you have considerably more technical knowledge than your teaching background would indicate." Agent Chen's tone remained pleasant, but the revelation of Margaret's true identity landed with the force of a sledgehammer against carefully constructed defenses. "Your real name is Margaret Chen, widow of Robert Chen, a Purple Heart recipient who died of cancer approximately 3 years ago. You were facing foreclosure proceedings when you disappeared from Nebraska, leaving behind substantial debts and a rental history that suggests increasing financial desperation. What we're trying to understand is how a broke widow managed to establish a new identity, relocate to Arizona, and begin living comfortably on resources that significantly exceed what any legitimate pension plan would provide." Margaret felt the last of her carefully maintained pretenses dissolving like sugar in rain. But she also felt something else. A strange sense of relief that came with no longer needing to maintain deceptions that had required constant vigilance and emotional energy. Ellen Richardson had been a successful creation, but she had also been a prison that isolated Margaret from authentic connections with other human beings.
"You're very thorough," Margaret said, her voice carrying the weary resignation of someone who had always known this conversation was inevitable. "Though I have to ask how you connected Margaret Chen to Ellen Richardson. The documentation was quite good according to the people who arranged it. Bank surveillance footage from Milgook, Nebraska, 3 weeks before you disappeared. You were photographed making a cash deposit that was unusually large for someone facing foreclosure. The facial recognition software flagged the match when we ran Ellen Richardson's driver's license photo through our database of persons of interest connected to the gas station investigation." Margaret laughed, a sound that carried more bitterness than humor. "Technology. I should have known that artificial intelligence would eventually be used to hunt down people who stumbled into artificial intelligence operations. There's a certain poetic justice in that, I suppose." Agent Chen leaned forward slightly, her expression shifting to something that might have been genuine curiosity rather than professional interrogation. "You did understand what you found in that bunker, didn't you? The sophistication of the money laundering operation, the AI systems that manage financial transactions across international borders, the implications for law enforcement agencies that lack the technological resources to compete with criminal enterprises that can adapt faster than legitimate institutions." The question revealed more about the federal investigation than Margaret had expected, suggesting that Agent Chen was interested in information rather than prosecution, intelligence gathering rather than arrest proceedings.
The distinction was important because it implied that Margaret might still have value as a source, rather than simply representing a loose end that needed to be eliminated through legal rather than violent means. "I understood enough to realize that I was in way over my head," Margaret admitted. "I was a homeless woman with 3 dogs, looking for shelter from a storm. I wasn't equipped to handle the kind of discovery that could get me killed by people who solve problems with considerably more violence than foreclosure proceedings and debt collection agencies." "But you were smart enough to negotiate your way out of that situation," Agent Chen observed. "Smart enough to secure resources that allow you to disappear completely and establish a new life in a different state. That kind of strategic thinking suggests capabilities that could be valuable in the right circumstances." Margaret studied the agent's expression, searching for clues about where this conversation was leading and what kind of choices might be available to someone whose carefully constructed retirement was crumbling under the weight of federal scrutiny. Agent Chen was offering something, not immunity exactly, but the possibility of cooperation that might preserve some version of the life Margaret had built in Arizona. "What exactly are you proposing?" "We want to understand how those AI systems work. We have the technological capabilities to analyze the hardware and software, but we need someone who understands the operational logic. The AI systems were applied to criminal enterprises in ways that traditional law enforcement techniques can't effectively counter." Margaret felt pieces of another puzzle clicking into place with the same satisfying precision she had experienced in the Nebraska bunker. "You've been watching the facility, but you haven't been able to access the underground areas because the security systems are too sophisticated for standard infiltration techniques. You need someone who has actually been inside. Someone who can help you understand how to approach AI-protected criminal operations." "The technology is spreading. We've identified similar operations in 12 states with indications that the model was being replicated internationally. Traditional law enforcement approaches aren't working because the systems can adapt faster than human investigators can adjust their techniques. We need to understand how these criminal AI networks function before they become so sophisticated that legitimate law enforcement becomes effectively obsolete." The implications were staggering, suggesting that Margaret had stumbled into something far more significant than a single money laundering operation. She had discovered a prototype for the future of organized crime, artificial intelligence applications that could eventually make traditional law enforcement as obsolete as cavalry charges in modern warfare. The knowledge she carried wasn't just valuable, it was potentially crucial to maintaining the rule of law in societies where criminal enterprises could outthink and outmaneuver legitimate authorities. "And in exchange for my cooperation?" Margaret asked. "Ellen Richardson gets to keep her comfortable retirement in Arizona, with the understanding that she's now a federal informant rather than a fugitive from justice. Margaret Chen remains officially deceased, her debts written off as uncollectible, her past problems resolved through bureaucratic processes that don't require her physical presence or legal acknowledgement." The offer was generous enough to suggest that Margaret's knowledge was indeed valuable, that federal agencies were willing to overlook significant crimes in exchange for intelligence that could help them understand threats that transcended individual cases or jurisdictions. But it also meant that her peaceful retirement would be permanently altered, that she would become part of the same shadow world she had tried to escape through careful disappearance and constructed anonymity. "There would be conditions," Agent Chen continued. "Periodic consultations when we encounter similar operations, debriefings about the technical details you observed, possibly occasional travel to other locations where comparable systems have been identified. Nothing that would compromise your safety or require extended absences from your home, but enough involvement to justify the resources we're investing in your continued existence as Ellen Richardson." Margaret looked toward the patio where Penny and Buster were sleeping in their favorite patch of morning sunshine, 2 aging dogs who had followed her through impossible circumstances and deserved to spend their remaining years in peace, rather than being dragged into federal investigations that could last for decades. But she also thought about the bunker beneath the Nebraska gas station,
about artificial intelligence systems that could launder money faster than human investigators could track it, about criminal enterprises that would eventually make traditional law enforcement irrelevant unless someone taught legitimate authorities how to fight back. "I need to think about it," she said finally. Agent Chen nodded and handed Margaret a business card that looked ordinary but probably contained sophisticated communication technology. "Take your time, but understand that the technology you discovered is spreading faster than our ability to counter it. Every month we delay gives criminal organizations more time to perfect systems that could eventually make them untouchable by legitimate law enforcement." After the agent left, Margaret sat on her patio and tried to process the implications of a choice that felt familiar despite its completely different context. Once again, she faced a decision between safety and principle, between personal comfort and larger responsibilities that she was uniquely qualified to address. The parallels to her original negotiation with Bill Henderson were unmistakable, although this time she was being recruited rather than threatened, offered partnership rather than exile. Penny woke from her nap and padded over to rest her graying muzzle on Margaret's lap, a gesture of comfort that transcended species boundaries and reminded her that some loyalties were more important than abstract principles about cooperation with authorities or resistance to criminal enterprises. These dogs had trusted her to make decisions that kept them alive and comfortable, and they deserved to have that trust honored, regardless of whatever larger battles were being fought in the shadows of American society. But Margaret also remembered the children she had taught during 30 years in high school classrooms, hundreds of young people who had learned from her that knowledge carried responsibilities, that understanding complex systems meant accepting obligations to use that understanding in ways that served something larger than personal comfort or individual survival. She had stumbled into knowledge about the future of organized crime, had seen firsthand how artificial intelligence could be weaponized by people who treated human suffering as a business expense. The choice would define not just her remaining years, but the kind of person she had become through surviving impossible circumstances that had stripped away everything except the essential core of who she was beneath the accumulated layers of social identity and professional obligation. Margaret Chen had been a teacher who believed that education could change the world one student at a time. Ellen Richardson was a refugee from that idealism, someone who had learned that survival sometimes required moral compromises that civilized societies discouraged in their citizens. But maybe there was a third option, a way to honor both the teacher's sense of responsibility and the refugee's hard-won understanding of what it cost to challenge forces that most people never realized existed. Maybe she could help federal agents understand how to fight artificial intelligence with artificial intelligence, how to level playing fields that criminal enterprises had tilted in their favor through superior technology and unlimited resources. The decision would wait until tomorrow or next week, or whenever she felt ready to transform Ellen Richardson's peaceful retirement into something more complicated, but potentially more meaningful than watching desert sunsets while aging dogs slept in patches of Arizona sunshine. Tonight, she would cook dinner for Penny and Buster, would sit with them on the patio while stars emerged in the vast sky, would allow herself to believe for a few more hours that some stories could end with comfortable retirement rather than continuing indefinitely through chapters that challenged every assumption about heroes and villains and the prices that ordinary people paid for stumbling into extraordinary circumstances. But deep down, Margaret already knew what her answer would be, just as she had known in that Nebraska bunker that survival sometimes required negotiations with devils who wore human faces and spoke in reasonable tones about unreasonable things. The teacher who had spent decades encouraging children to ask dangerous questions was still alive beneath Ellen Richardson's carefully constructed anonymity, and that teacher understood that knowledge without action was just another form of cowardice dressed up in academic respectability. The dogs would be safe regardless of what choice she made. Agent Chen had made that clear, and federal agencies had resources that transcended anything criminal organizations could bring to bear against retired teachers who cooperated with legitimate authorities. But Margaret's peace of mind would depend on whether she could look at herself in mirrors and see someone who had used her unique knowledge to serve something larger than personal comfort, or just another refugee from responsibility who had chosen safety over service, when the world needed people brave enough to fight battles that most citizens never knew were being fought. The sun completed its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert sky in familiar shades of amber and rose that had welcomed her to Arizona and sustained her through the gradual process of healing from wounds that poverty and desperation had inflicted on her sense of self-worth and human dignity. But as she sat there with Penny and Buster and the gathering twilight, Margaret's mind was already working through the implications of Agent Chen's offer and the larger battle it represented. Three days later, Margaret called the number on Agent Chen's card at precisely 9 a.m., her decision crystallized by a restless night spent thinking about the children she had taught and the future they would inherit if criminal organizations became technologically superior to the people sworn to protect society from their depredations. The conversation was brief and professional, arrangements made for a meeting at a small cafe in downtown Tucson where federal agents apparently conducted business with informants who preferred public settings to government buildings. "I've been thinking about what you said," Margaret told Agent Chen over coffee that was considerably better than anything she had been able to afford during her homeless months, about criminal AI systems spreading faster than law enforcement can adapt. I keep remembering my students. Hundreds of kids over 30 years who trusted me to prepare them for a world that might be controlled by people who use technology to commit crimes that traditional police work can't solve.
Agent Chen nodded, her expression suggesting she'd expected this decision but was pleased to have it confirmed. The scope of the problem is larger than most people realize. What you discovered in Nebraska wasn't an isolated operation. It was a prototype for systems that are being replicated across North America and internationally. We estimate that within 5 years, traditional financial crimes investigation will be essentially obsolete unless we develop new approaches to AI-assisted criminal enterprises. Margaret felt the familiar thrill that had once accompanied introducing students to complex scientific concepts that would change their understanding of how the world actually worked. "Tell me about the other operations. How similar are they to what I saw in the bunker?" "Remarkably similar, which suggests centralized design and distribution rather than independent development. The same artificial intelligence architecture, the same security protocols, even the same camouflage strategies using abandoned or neglected surface properties to hide sophisticated underground facilities. Someone is building a network of AI-powered money laundering operations that can function with minimal human oversight while generating enormous profits for criminal organizations." The implications were staggering, suggesting that Margaret had stumbled into the early stages of a technological revolution that could fundamentally alter the balance of power between criminal enterprises and legitimate law enforcement. She thought about the computer systems she'd observed in the Nebraska bunker, their patient processing of financial data through algorithms that could identify optimal laundering strategies faster than human accountants could understand the transactions they were designed to conceal. "What exactly do you need from me?" Margaret asked. "Initially, detailed technical debriefings about everything you observed in the facility, the layout, the computer systems, the security measures, the operational protocols, anything that might help us understand how these AI networks function and how they might be vulnerable to countermeasures. But eventually, we may need your help developing new investigative techniques that can match the speed and sophistication of artificial intelligence systems." Margaret leaned back in her chair, processing the magnitude of what Agent Chen was proposing. "You're talking about using AI to fight AI, teaching law enforcement agencies to think like machines instead of human investigators following traditional procedures that were designed for criminals who made human mistakes." "Exactly. We need consultants who understand both the technology and the criminal applications, people who can help us develop artificial intelligence systems that can outthink criminal AI networks. It's an arms race, essentially, and we're currently losing because we're still fighting 21st century crimes with 20th century techniques." The conversation continued for 2 hours, Agent Chen providing details about other facilities that had been identified through various investigative techniques, always just out of reach of traditional law enforcement methods that required human agents to understand and infiltrate operations that functioned according to machine logic rather than human psychology. Margaret felt herself sketching diagrams on napkins, explaining the technical architecture she'd observed and hypothesizing about how similar systems might be configured for different criminal applications. The beauty of AI-powered operations, she explained, is that they can adapt to law enforcement pressure in real time. Traditional criminal organizations are vulnerable because they require human decision-making, which introduces delays and errors that create opportunities for investigation and infiltration. But AI can process law enforcement data as quickly as criminal data, adjusting operations to minimize risk faster than human investigators can recognize patterns. Agent Chen was taking notes on a device that looked like a standard tablet but probably contained communication encryption sophisticated enough to protect federal intelligence from the same technological superiority that made criminal AI networks so effective. Which is why we need people who understand the technology well enough to think like the systems we're trying to counter. Traditional investigators are trained to understand human psychology and behavior patterns, but AI doesn't have psychology. It has algorithms that process data according to logic trees that can be incredibly complex.
Margaret felt the familiar satisfaction that had once accompanied successful teaching moments when students grasped concepts that initially seemed beyond their comprehension. But this was different. Instead of preparing teenagers for standardized tests and college applications, she was helping federal agents understand threats that could eventually undermine the rule of law in democratic societies. "I'll need guarantees about my dogs," she said finally. "Penny and Buster are old, and they've been through enough trauma to last several lifetimes. Whatever arrangement we make, it has to ensure that they spend their remaining years in comfort and security, with access to the best veterinary care and no disruption to the routine they've finally learned to trust." "Of course," Agent Chen agreed immediately. "In fact, your cover as Ellen Richardson works better if you maintain the same living situation and daily patterns. We're not asking you to become an undercover agent or relocate to Washington for training programs. The consultation work can be done from your home, with occasional travel when we encounter new facilities that require on-site analysis." Over the following weeks, Margaret settled into a routine that felt like a strange hybrid of retirement and employment. Peaceful mornings with aging dogs, followed by encrypted video conferences with federal agents who needed her expertise to understand criminal enterprises that operated according to principles she had learned through desperate circumstances, rather than formal training. The work was intellectually challenging in ways that reminded her why she had become a teacher in the first place. The satisfaction of helping people understand complex systems that seemed incomprehensible until someone explained the underlying logic that made them function. But it was also emotionally exhausting, requiring her to revisit memories of hunger and homelessness, and the underground bunker where she had first encountered technology that criminals were using to stay ahead of the people trying to stop them. The federal agents she worked with were universally professional and respectful, treating her as a valued consultant rather than a former criminal who had been granted immunity in exchange for cooperation. But Margaret could sense their frustration with investigations that seemed to always be one step behind opponents who could process information and adjust strategies faster than human investigators could understand what they were really fighting. "Traditional law enforcement depends on criminals making mistakes," Agent Chen explained during one of their regular sessions. "But AI doesn't make mistakes in the human sense. It just processes data according to its programming. When we shut down one money laundering route, the system instantly calculates alternative paths and reroutes transactions before we can even understand how the original scheme worked." Margaret had been thinking about this problem during her daily walks with Penny and Buster, contemplating the desert ecosystem that surrounded their home and the way predator-prey relationships had evolved over millions of years through constant adaptation and counter-adaptation. What you need, she said, is not just AI that can think as fast as criminal AI, but artificial intelligence that can think differently. Systems that approach problems from angles that criminal algorithms haven't been programmed to anticipate. This suggestion sparked months of collaboration between Margaret and federal technology specialists, developing AI systems that could analyze criminal networks from perspectives that transcended traditional law enforcement approaches. Instead of following money trails or tracking individual transactions, their experimental systems looked for patterns that revealed the underlying logic structures that criminal AI networks use to make decisions. It's like teaching computers to think like teachers instead of police officers. Instead of trying to catch criminals in the act, we're helping artificial intelligence understand the educational principles that criminal systems use to learn from law enforcement pressure and adapt their operations accordingly. The breakthrough came 8 months into their collaboration, when Margaret's insights about machine learning algorithms helped federal AI specialists develop systems that could predict how criminal networks would adapt to specific law enforcement actions. For the first time, legitimate authorities had technology that could think ahead of criminal AI instead of always reacting to operations that had already moved beyond traditional investigative techniques.
We're calling it Predictive Criminal Artificial Intelligence Analysis, Agent Chen announced during a video conference that included federal agents from multiple agencies and academic consultants from universities that Margaret recognized from her former life as a science teacher. Instead of chasing criminal AI systems after they've adapted to our pressure, we're using AI to predict how they'll adapt and positioning our countermeasures before they realize they need to change their operations. Margaret felt a pride that transcended personal satisfaction, the same feeling she had experienced when former students contacted her years later to thank her for preparing them for careers in science and technology. But this was different. Instead of helping individual young people understand complex concepts, she was helping legitimate authorities maintain their ability to protect society from criminals who had gained access to technology that could eventually make traditional law enforcement obsolete. The dogs seemed to sense her renewed sense of purpose, Penny and Buster spending more time on the patio while Margaret worked at the computer equipment that federal technicians had installed in her spare bedroom. They were comfortable with her new routine, content to sleep in patches of sunshine while she participated in video conferences with agents who were using her insights to develop new approaches to criminal investigations that required machine intelligence rather than human intuition. But Margaret also knew that their time together was measured in months rather than years. Penny's breathing had become more labored during their morning walks, and Buster's energy levels were declining despite his continued enthusiasm for greeting neighbors and investigating desert wildlife. They were dying as gracefully as Duke had, but they were dying nonetheless. And Margaret found herself treasuring each ordinary moment with creatures who had shared extraordinary adventures and trusted her to make decisions that kept them safe through circumstances that should have destroyed them all. "What will you do when they're gone?" Agent Chen asked during one of their regular consultations, her tone suggesting genuine concern rather than professional curiosity. Margaret looked toward the patio where Penny and Buster were sleeping in their favorite patch of afternoon sunshine, two aging dogs who had earned their rest through loyalty that transcended species boundaries and devotion that had sustained her through the darkest chapters of her life. "I suppose I'll keep working with you, as long as criminal organizations keep using AI to stay ahead of law enforcement," she said. "But I'll also probably get more dogs, shelter animals who need someone to give them a chance at the kind of life these boys have had. Comfortable, safe, loved. It seems like the right way to honor what they've meant to me." The sunset was particularly spectacular that evening, painting the Arizona sky in shades of gold and crimson that made Margaret's modest backyard look like something from a nature documentary. She sat with Penny and Buster while stars emerged in the vast darkness, each point of light a reminder that some things endured no matter how dramatically the world changed around them.